The Garden Report is brought to you by Prize Picks and the Game Time app.
Hey, Buddy Manning here. Welcome to the Garden Report. And people are talking about it. It's probably my least favorite topic ever. But
that's how I feel about the NBA Cup.
All right, yeah. So we did Noah's least favorite topic in our last video, the NBA Cup. And now we're going to do my least favorite topic, which is the ratings discussion. Ratings down to start this year, down over years in the NBA, which I don't think is something you can ignore. I know you and John talked about this on post-game after the Wizards game. And talk about a game that's not going to draw many eyeballs. I saw someone say, how many people in the Washington area do you think watch Wizard road games on a Friday night? And they were like, 100, 200? Like, it must be insanely low. And that's one of the bigger problems right now is you have a lot of teams that don't matter. You have a regular season overall that doesn't have major stakes. Back to our cup conversation, I don't think anyone understands what the stakes are there either. And the biggest one by far is that the stars are often injured or just missing games on a regular basis for load management. So that's where I'm going in terms of the biggest reason structurally on the court in the game that is a reason ratings could be down compared to 10 years ago when more players were playing 82 games or upwards of that. But for you, it's more of a consumption thing from what you've said.
That's what I think. So again, I'm biased. I love watching basketball. I literally could watch NBA, Wizards, Pistons on a Sunday night and find that interesting. So I try to take myself out of the equation as far as the actual product as much as I can. That being said, I think there's a lot of discourse around the game being worse. And when you go back and watch old NBA, like, I do think that there's advantages in the way that teams are structured. They're running more set plays. It's a lot less random. But the individual skill set, I mean, I watched the Heat game last night versus the Pistons. The shot making down the stretch in that game was literally insane. Between Tim Hardaway and Tyler Hero, I mean, it was like, it literally looked edited. And so if you're an NBA fan and you're turning on this game and you can't appreciate like the talent that is on the floor every single night, I don't know if people aren't aware of how talented players are, if they're not watching the right games, or if they're just simply not watching, so they're more consuming the discourse. But I don't really buy the product thing. And I know people are going to disagree with me on this. I think there's always going to be bad games. You have literally a dozen games a night and, 82 games a season. So there's going to be great games and there's going to be not so great games. But ultimately, like, the product is still phenomenal in my opinion. So I think it is more about how we're packaging these games, how we're discussing them. There's a level of apathy from the media, from fans. It's when you're emotional and excited, you're corny. When you're celebrating something, it's embarrassing. Like, I think there's a way that we have kind of whether it's the rise of social media, whether it's the way the national media just focuses on a handful of players, but I don't like the way we talk about basketball. I don't like the way that we talk about NBA players, the way we talk about teams, and I think over time, it's created a level of apathy where even things like the Celtics winning the championship and Tatum celebrating, everything becomes like a meme. Everything becomes like it's embarrassing to be emotional over a regular season win because why? It's just a regular season win. And then by saying that, you're devaluing that game. And I think basketball gets it more than other sports. Granted, I don't follow other sports nearly as much, but I think a lot of it is the discourse around it. And then there's a whole other conversation around people watching highlights, people watching illegal streaming over broadcast television. I know a lot of people that just go home and watch all the house of highlights of all the games that took place that night, and then they'll listen to podcasts about the sport, but they don't actually need to sit there for 2.5 hours. So it's a very complicated discussion. I have like a million thoughts on it, but I think those are some of the reasons why I think it's maybe not as fair as just about the product being worse.
Yeah, and the product hasn't changed a ton in a while now. You probably have to go way back for when they moved the three-point line, defensive 3 seconds, like major structural changes to the game bent on changing how it's played, how it looks, all those sort of things. I can't even remember what the most recent one would have been from that perspective. So when you're looking at the quality of the games, there are a lot more blowouts. There are a lot more major swings in games just because of the nature of the three-point shooting, that becoming such a frequently used shot in the game. So I do think they need to take a look at that because people, whether it's true or not, you get those clips of like guys going back and forth, just launching shots and missing them. You had the 75 misses, right, in that game recently, the Hornets game. So I think they need to assess changes to the game because when you look at the other sports, as you mentioned, Football, it feels like they change stuff every year to try to make things more interesting. Baseball, it took them a long, long time, and it hasn't shown in the ratings yet necessarily in a major way, but they put in a pitch clock to make the game go faster. It cut 30 minutes per game off the game immediately, and there was a lot of consternation over, is this going to hurt the game? Players didn't like it, that sort of thing. So any idea we might have about how you would change the way the NBA game's played would be met with a lot of resistance. But it's probably going to have to happen at some point, because I just think the style of the game right now, the amount of threes that are taken and how that can disrupt, obviously how close games are, but also how the game looks. I think that's part of it here, and that's not the whole story, but I don't think it's just like, people are watching more on social media, people aren't actually watching, the traditional way. I do think, at least from a regular season perspective, there's less overall interest in the sport on a day-to-day basis, at least game to game.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely something to that. And from a product state, it's almost like there's two different conversations. There's how do you improve the product and actually make that a better experience for consumers? And there's a long list of things. The last few minutes taking as long as they do just kills people. I see the way people talk about slow endings online.
Yeah, and there's a solution to that,
right,
too.
So there's lots of solutions there. I think pushing the line back potentially, making that a little bit more challenging. We could do a whole, we could talk forever about the in-game changes. I still don't think those in-game changes are what's going to make a big difference in the ratings. And again, we're both speculating. We don't really actually know. But to me, it's just overwhelming negativity. It's the fact that we're not really storytelling very well. I don't think that people know a lot about this new wave of stars. We know about LeBron and Steph, and those guys have been sold really, really well. And I think people say there just aren't as natural stars the way that those guys were, and those are all-time greats. It was a gift to grow up during the time that LeBron and Steph were playing at the same time. That I'm not going to say that every 10 years you're going to have that type of talent, in the league at the same time. But even so, there are plenty of players that just have not been marketed well enough. I think that are the overwhelming, inclination to lean towards negativity and criticism, and for national voices to say, this team doesn't know how to play basketball, or these guys are bad. It just turns people off ultimately. It's maybe entertaining at points and it can be funny sometimes, but I think in the big picture of things, if you're just hearing negative things about the sport that you are watching, you're eventually going to be even if you don't realize that, I think eventually you're going to be turned away from it. So I think everybody has a responsibility to do a better job storytelling when it comes to teams in the league, when it comes to superstars, when it comes to prospects. This is the same thing in the WNBA. I remember
I was just going to go there, yeah.
Yeah, I was just covering the WNBA finals, and everybody was kind of saying, the Minnesota Lynx, nobody really knows who they are. What a boring matchup. We were hoping that it was going to be the Aces, and most people didn't really know anything about the Minnesota Lynx. I was on the ground covering them. They were the funniest team and the most exciting team that I've ever covered. No offense to the Celtics, but really they were so personable, so many big personalities and storylines, and they only came out during the finals because they didn't really have any national attention all season. So we have to do a better job of actually unearthing these stories and actually elevating them to the national platform so that people are invested not just in 3 or 4 guys, and then they're hurt, and then suddenly you don't care anymore because you don't actually care about anybody else because you haven't been told enough about them. So
right. Yeah, and I do think the WNBA is starting to inch ahead of the NBA in terms of the personalities and the characters and all those different things, the interpersonal stuff sometimes. The NBA, and it's understandable, right? We're 75 years in. There's so much money involved. There's a safety, I think, with the biggest personalities and how they approach things, whether it's stuff they're saying or how often they're in the games. There's just a greater business stake, I think, in terms of taking things from a safe standpoint.
Absolutely.
And the WNBA, I think, just given the upward trajectory and where it's at and some of the people involved, I think has already produced some greater personalities, greater storylines between the players, those sort of things, for good and for bad, obviously, as you've experienced.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you make a great point about the level of safety, and also just the awareness about the media that so many NBA stars, especially the up and coming generation, they're so media trained that they're so careful with their words. And obviously, from our standpoint, it makes our lives harder to get interesting things. But I also think from a consumer standpoint, if you're watching clips of guys and they're pretty monotone, or they're not saying a whole lot, and they're not being very expressive because they're kind of protecting their image, it makes them less likely to connect to those players. I mean, every time I watch Steph Curry in an interview, I think to myself, part of why people love him is not just because he's exciting and because he can shoot crazy threes, but it's the way he carries himself, the way he talks. He's very open, and there's not a lot of stars like him from a personality standpoint. And so some of these younger guys that have been a little bit more open with the media, like Anthony Edwards, they've really benefited from it. So that's not a league-wide thing, because I think there's enough players that are open, but on an individual level, if I was somebody's PR consultant, I would tell these players, I think the more open that you are, obviously sometimes it's going to come back to bite you if you say the wrong thing, and I'm totally cognizant of that, but I think overwhelmingly it's going to make the world embrace those players a little bit more, and we're missing a little bit of that. I think people are pretty closed off right now, and it makes it hard for fans at home to connect with some of these stars.
Well, let us know what you think the state of the game is, any problems you have with it, or why you watch or don't watch below. I'm sure there'll be a lot of good-natured discussion there. For Noah Dalzell, I'm Bobby Manning. This has been the Garden Report Practice Edition. Check out Prize Picks. Check out the Game Time app right now as well. And we'll be back here tomorrow for another practice before a home and home between the Bulls and Celtics on Thursday and Saturday. Hey, Bobby Manning here. If you made it this far, you probably enjoyed this video, so subscribe, turn on notifications, and check out our social media platforms at Celtics CLNS.